So, with our goal of minimizing error in mind, we have 5 main sampling techniques. The first is called random sampling, and the name kind of tells you what we're doing. If you're trying to identify what type of sampling is being used, usually you'll see the word random in there. For this, we want every possibility in the population to be equally likely, and then we have another specification on there where we say a sample is simple random if it is such that every sample of the same size is equally likely. This is something where often you'll be looking for a kind of random generation, where to draw back to that example that I started with, where we're talking about looking at books, we could collect a random sample by looking at ISBN numbers and randomly drawing those based on some classification. Usually, you see the word random, you know it's going to be random. Next, we have what is called a stratified sample, where I'll say that methods 2 and 3, when I get to 3, are fairly similar. The difference between the two is a little bit subtle, but what we do with a stratified sample is take our whole selection and break the population down into groups and select representatives from each of the groups. So, for example, if we're going to think about those books again, I could break down all books ever written into categories by author, where I could then select some number of books at random. Usually when we're making these kind of selections, there is a little bit of randomness if we're going to be good, but here the defining characteristic is breaking things down, looking at each group, and selecting some of each group. Not the entire thing, vitally, but some of each group. Then, for a cluster sample, we're going to start in much the same way. We're going to take our group and we are going to break it down into categories. And instead of selecting from each category, we are going to select things within. We are going to select entire categories, that is. So I'm going to break things down by author. I could then select every work by Paulo Freire, every work by John Fonte, and every work by Stephen King. That necessarily be the most representative sample? Maybe, maybe not. I suppose Stephen King, for all his talents and faults, is a fairly verbose writer, but not all are. Point is, what we are doing with a cluster sample is breaking into groups and then randomly selecting some of the groups in their entirety. So like I said, these two are very closely related. For stratified, we take representatives from each. For cluster, entire groups are the representatives. And then next, we have systematic sampling, where systematic sampling is, in my opinion, the easiest one to identify, where for this, what you do is make a selection based on a fixed repeated pattern, something like every 10th. Every kth is the general term that sometimes is used for this. So, for example, you could go to your local library and look on the shelf and take every 10th and 35th book from every shelf, and that could be your sample, where you are drawing based on a fixed repeated pattern. That is systematic sampling. And then finally, we have the worst, in many ways, sampling technique, which is convenience sampling. If you're ever wondering whether something drawn is a convenient sample, just think to yourself, did it seem lazy? Because for a convenient sample, you're drawing based on what is easiest. So if I want to draw a convenient sample for books, I would just take the ones that happen to be nearby because they were on the floor from when I shot that video earlier. Convenient samples are just get what you can. Don't worry about if it's any good. It's close. That's good enough. So check for laziness if you're thinking about whether something is a convenient sample.